All right, and welcome to the hashtag IBMI Everywhere podcast, a podcast to promote the IBMI platform. Have today the pleasure of speaking with Gregory Simmons of PC Richard and Son. Really, thanks so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah. So, it's always a pleasure. I've seen you around at a lot of different events. And, one of the things I noticed was and the most interesting thing perhaps about your history. I saw that you were an instructor for RPG. Is that really true?
Yeah, I've been an instructor since 2007. I never envisioned that I would be an instructor for RPG, but a friend of mine asked me if I would fill in for him one semester, and one semester turned into 15 years, I guess.
Have you seen like an evolution of the students? What have you been seeing like in the trends of students over the years?
That's a good question. I think the overall perception that I've seen is that the students are younger and younger. It can't be that I'm getting older and older, right? So it's definitely that the
Yes.
students are getting younger. But the overwhelming thing is that the perception is that they started out by saying, well, I gotta, and if I want to get promoted or get this other job, I gotta have this RPG language, and it's going to be tough and hard and not so much fun, but let's get through it. And I say, well, what did you first see about it? Who showed you RPG? Tell me about it. And they're like, well, it's this whole green screen and it's fixed. These stuff has to be in this exact correct order, and it's really hard to use. And pretty quickly, I started showing them. Back in the day, I started showing them. Well, let's look at RPG. What it currently is. Everybody has legacy code that is fixed format, but RPG is actually free format, and we can use something newer, like back then was RDI, or more recently VS Code, and all of a sudden RPG looks fairly close to like you're writing some JavaScript, and the younger students are able to relate to that a lot more.
Do you find that but there's still a lot of that legacy code living out there, and how do you teach that for those students as they're going through the waters of, they're used to the GitHub world and the other formats out there. So how do you bridge that gap?
Yeah, that's a good question, and it's hard. I always teach all of my classes in free format, and oftentimes they will joke at each other because they know that if I come around and I see them in SEU, that they're going to get a slap on the hands, the proverbial ruler crack across the knuckles. So you have to get comfortable with it, but it is inevitable that they're going to be in some fixed format, and I kind of, if you can read it in free format, it reads pretty much the same in fixed format. Take small examples and debug it and play with the debug and watch it cycle through everything that it's got to cycle through. That's really the big thing. Here recently, we've had my previous class that just ended a couple of weeks ago. We're actually starting to play with AI code assistants and say, take this piece of free format code and convert it to RPG 400 for me, or fixed format RPG. And it actually does a pretty good job. There's
Wow.
certain things that it gets more complicated because, if you have some of the newer built-in functions that were only made while we have free format, some of that stuff doesn't really convert backward, but pretty interesting to be able to then have apples and apples and see what that exact same code looks like.
That is a really interesting thing. So when you're teaching them, part of the curriculum is learning about how to use code assistants.
Yeah, we definitely get in there and play with those. It's always enlightening and exciting to, and it's also a great teaching tool. And when you ask the code assistant, hey, write me an example of a procedure that say calculates the Fibonacci sequence or demonstrates the Fibonacci sequence, and it'll do that for you. And so you kind of see how AI will form the code, but then I challenge them to say, okay, well, AI gave you one version. Now you figure out a different way to write it and improve upon that. So it's good and it's exciting. It gets them engaged. You're all of a sudden taking what you think is an archaic language and you're using a very new IDEs and you're using AI code assistants to really do some fascinating things with RPG.
Wow. Do you find that like when you're teaching your students like that you could see that being applied to, let's say, organizations as they're teaching or looking to hire new RPG talent, or if, let's say, other languages to be able to interface with RPG as well? Would you suggest that like that would be the proper way of going about it, using some of those techniques that you just mentioned?
Yeah, for sure. I'm now a project manager, and so the developers that work for me, I pretty much insist that they have the code assistant installed in VS Code, because sometimes you may start to have the thought in your mind on a blank line of what's going to come next, and the code assistant will suggest something, and you may not have. That's not exactly what I had in my head, but I like the where that code is going, and so it kind of helps spur that along. The way that it helps you speed up is just amazing. Fundamental things like after every SQL statement, the very next statement I'm always coaching should always be check for if the SQL code is less than 0. So we know that did the SQL statement work or did we have a problem? And so we check for SQL code less than 0, and if it is, then we have a common procedure that we write out to that writes a log of that. And the code assistant will see that I just finished a SQL statement and then say, okay, do you want to check for SQL code less than 0? And then in that if statement, write out to that same procedure. All of the mundane coding, it just, yep, that's exactly what I want. Yep, tab. Now I can concentrate on coding the business logic as opposed to all of the mundane stuff that everybody codes. Really awesome stuff.
So that's amazing, and I think that from an efficiency standpoint, that must have be a game changer for your team. What type of efficiency gains have you been seeing?
I mean, it's hard to put a measuring stick on, but every single one of my team members, they can't imagine coding a coding life without it anymore. I mean, there's just so much things are just faster because you know that if I write this SQL statement, the next thing is I want to write out to the common log if something went wrong. And it also says, well, in your SQL statement, you were using these host variables. So let's insert these host variables into the string that we're going to output also. When we read the logs, it automatically has, and this was our cart ID, and this was this other value, and this was the invoice number. All of there is just handled for you. I mean, it's hard to put a 38% or anything like that, but it's significant so much that once our CTO saw how myself and my team were using it, and just to show some of these basic examples, our whole department has it now. I mean, it's a no-brainer.
Which tool are you using?
GitHub Copilot is what we use right now. After being at Tech Exchange, I was starting to play around. I haven't had a whole lot of time to play with it, but I've started playing with running Olama on my system so that I can run the granite.code extension. That one is a lot more powerful because it accepts 19 million parameters, I think, in its large language model. The numbers get staggering, but GitHub Copilot so far has really blown me away with the code completion that it does for you.
Yeah. Wow. Thankful. That's a really amazing things you're seeing in your teaching life. I got a couple of questions for you with you mentioned some stories about you working on other systems aside from IBMI. Mind sharing some stories around that?
Sure. So in '94, I started working for a company part-time, and he had just gotten a new AS400, which was a little bit old even then. But so he started out working on the AS400, and that's where I started coding. And if we want to get technical about it, that was a small shop. And one of the first tasks that he had for me was that he needed a modem switched out. And so it was up mounted on the wall in a corner, and it was really high up there for whatever reason, because that was what was logical back in the 90s. But the System 38 had been pushed off to that corner, and he said, it's a strong system, it'll hold you. And so I had to stand on top of the System 38 to swap out that modem. So technically speaking, I did start my career on the System 38.
Great story.
Yeah.
Well, Gregory, I really appreciate your time. Thanks so much for joining us today. And we'll continue keeping in touch. And thanks so much for joining the #IBMI Everywhere podcast. Thanks so much.
Yep, thanks.